Thank you. May I ask, I know that there's been an intense and emotional and critical debate that preceded us, and I know it's difficult to segue into another subject, but it's equally important. And so I'm going to ask that the doors get shut and that everyone please do take their seats. First of all, it's an honor for me to be here. It's an honor for me to be in this country, and I want to thank my hosts, Arun Puri, and my new best friends, Manjira Datta and Mala Sekhri, who have personally introduced me to the next generation, what it means to be a next generation Indian professional woman role model. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is the lessons that I've learned from watching my own country live through a recent gender revolution. And I'm not going to draw any direct comparisons or any direct lessons because obviously we all know the pitfalls of someone from the West making assumptions about a country as complex and in the midst of its development as India, but I am going to talk about lessons learned and talk about a possible way to avoid the mistakes that we feminists made in the last 15 years of our own revolution and build on the power that we all have as women and those who support women to create truly peaceful and massive transformation in your country as well as mine. So I'd like to, honestly, I'll be honest, the incredibly intense sectarian energy that was here a few minutes ago has shaken me. And would you all help me in kind of taking a deep breath and starting over, clearing the room a little bit to, not of the ideas, of course, but of that very, very fierce sectarian energy. Because really, in a way, what I'm going to be talking to you about today is a counter-vision to that sectarian energy. Once upon a time, and I'm going to start with a little joke, there was a revolution. Can you hear me if I pace around like this? No. Wire the mic? How about if I just do this? Okay. As often happens in revolutions, 3 of the revolutionaries were caught and charged with treason and taken to be beheaded, and these were 2 men and a woman. So the first revolutionary was taken to the guillotine, and the headsman asked the guy, how do you want to die? Do you want to die facing up or facing down? And he thought, and he said, I'll face down. So the headsman pulled the string, and nothing happened. The crowd went wild. They said, it's a miracle, God has intervened, set this guy free. So they set him free. Thank you. The second revolutionary, was taken to the guillotine. And again, it was a guy. And the headsman asked him, can you hear me? No. You got to turn it on. I'm on. The headsman asked the guy, yes? All right. How do you want to die? Facing up or facing down? And again, he said, I'll face down. So the headsman pulled the string, and nothing happened. The crowd went wild. It's a miracle. I'll step back to the mic. God has intervened, they said. Set the guy free. They set him free. The third revolutionary, and this is where everything has to do with consciousness, which is what I'm going to be talking to you about today. The third revolutionary came to the guillotine, and the headsman asked her, how do you want to die? And she took a deep breath, and she said, I'll face up. So again, the headsman pulled the string, and nothing happened. And she said, I think I see what the problem is. So this, of course, is a joke about how even the best of revolutions go astray when we internalize attitudes that we're supposed to be fighting. And there's a profound lesson, and it goes to precisely what I've called in my second book, Power Feminism, a profound lesson for women in the United States and women in India about this anecdote. Because you are all familiar with a feminist discourse that analyzes what's oppressing women, what the obstacles are, and essentially stops at complaining about that or making despairing efforts to stand up against a monolithic patriarchy. Power feminism, and in some ways, I think India is poised to show the rest of the world what women's empowerment can truly be and look like in power feminist terms in the next decade, decade and a half. Power feminism is the obverse of this. Power feminism means looking at, analyzing, acknowledging all of the obstacles that we know are there, and then identifying, accounting for, and using your power to put pressure on the institutions to transform the society, to create true equality for women. Let me tell you what we did in my country, and then I'm going to talk about possibilities for India. In 1991, in the United States, the world changed for women. And what happened seemed simple. Anita Hill accused Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment. Probably all of you are familiar with this, watershed. Now, whatever American women felt, I really want to pace around, but I guess I just can't. Thank you. Thank you. I'll just grasp this phallic technology gently but firmly and pace around. Whatever American women felt about the rights and wrongs in this case, what happened is very comparable to what Indian women of all classes are sort of becoming more and more alert to right now. American women at that moment experienced a recognition that theirs was a democracy barren of female representation, right? Because Congress was just going to paper this over. So for once, 70 years after American women got the vote in 1920, they put their actions where their interests were. And in the immediate follow-up after the Hill-Thomas hearings, American women rose up in a kind of spontaneous voter rebellion, and all kinds of change happened immediately, okay? They tripled the number of women in high office on the state level. They added senators to the lists who were women. They then did something extraordinary, which is that they sent money to pro-woman lobbies like Emily's List, a Democratic pro-choice lobby, and it became the biggest lobby in Washington, bigger than the National Rifle Association, okay? And that was a war chest that was able to continue putting pressure on the political system, raising the numbers of women on the state and national level. Subsequently, Bill Clinton in 1992 was swept in on this wave of female anger with a 12% gender gap, and he knew who put him in office. And whatever you may feel about sort of the ups and downs of that administration for women, and there were some complicated moments, the fact is that he delivered a massive pro-woman legislative agenda. Everything from a female Secretary of State who was putting sex trafficking and female genital mutilation and Grameen microcredit loans on the global agenda for the very first time, on the World Bank agenda for the very first time, all the way to putting teeth in the laws against sexual harassment and discrimination in the workplace of the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, to opening up opportunities for women in the military, to putting another feminist on the Supreme Court. And the results, 12 years later are absolutely extraordinary. If you were to tell me in 1991 the kinds of issues that are now center stage, even with a Bush administration in my country, issues like pay equity, sex discrimination, sex harassment, flex time, putting teeth in the laws against rapists and those who commit domestic violence. It's like a feminist wish list, okay? It's like I'm dreaming. It's extraordinary. Much as I personally hate this administration, but, America has woken up to the fact that it is women who elect our leaders. So why is this relevant? Women are so used, and American women, Indian women, women are so used to being addressed as if they are a marginal, secondary concern that we tend not to notice when we have changed the world very quickly through our own efforts. That's power feminism, noticing that and building on that. So the lesson for us from these events and the new ways that women use their access to create a complete transformation of the political landscape is that women of all races and all classes are not a minority. Women are the majority in India as well as the United States, globally. We cast the majority of the votes. This is true in India as well as the United States. We spend the majority of the consumer rupee, the consumer dollar, and there is no limit to what we can demand when we begin to learn to use our power effectively. What is hard for us is a matter of consciousness. What is hard for us is to take that leap into understanding that we are in fact not in a democratic system, an oppressed minority at the mercy of others. That when we use our power, we're not even in the co-pilot seat, we're flying the plane. Feel free to cheer. So in my own country, there are, tremendous problems and challenges. They're getting worse all the time. You can invite me back next year to talk about, the issues and crises that we're facing in the United States. But what I'd like to do now is take this opportunity to kind of summarize what I've learned from traveling around the world and watching women being at this point that we were at, that women in the developing world are spearheading, so that you can save a decade, essentially, of the mistakes that we made. And really, as I say, because Indian women in India is in a position to kind of showcase, and I'll get to this, a kind of ethical globalization, a kind of ethical feminist leadership to the rest of the world, really shoot ahead, leading us into a more egalitarian future. So, very briefly, what I like about my understanding of Indian feminism, or the Indian push for gender equality, is that it largely has avoided some of the dead ends of American feminism. I don't see Indian feminism, bashing men the way that we unfortunately sometimes did rhetorically in the 80s. I don't see a kind of false dichotomy that you're either a working woman or in the family, though I understand that there are profound complications and pressures around how to be a working woman in the Indian family. But what I do want to say is you can save time. In our case, it took 70 years to figure this out. Let me suggest that you don't spend any time trying to fall into this error. Don't try to persuade politicians to do the right thing. Don't try to persuade corporations to do the right thing, because it doesn't work. It simply doesn't work. There is no incentive for people who hold power willingly to give up power, no matter how nice they are individually. There's no incentive. You saw this in South Africa. Why should whites say, you know what, I'm making too much money. I own too much property. Come take my property. No matter how decent you are as a human being, it's very difficult. And if women ran the world, it would be difficult for us too to say, you know what, guys, too much money. Take a third of my paycheck. I'm tired of you massaging my feet and giving me bonbons. It's like, enough of this. Let me do the dishes, right? So what I recommend is that I won't say you. What I recommend is that feminists spearheading change, especially in the developing world, tread more gently than we did in cultural terms, but play hardball with female clout where it counts, which is in 3 areas: votes, money, and media. So what have we got as women? These are the solutions. The vote in a democratic society, it's extraordinary. So many people on the left think that corporations run the world. And corporations do run the world to some extent, but I've worked on 2 successful presidential campaigns. We won the election both times, though we didn't win the office both times. And my job was speaking to women voters. And yes, corporate power was at the table when these politicians were making decisions, but voters were also at the table. I mean, they were desperate for every single vote. And this is a challenge for women in India because you have a parliament, just like it's a challenge for women in Australia or in the United Kingdom. What do I mean by this? It's very fashionable to talk about the corrupting influence of money in American politics, right? You've all heard about that. What tends not to be acknowledged is that in America, the corrupting influence of money also has a very salutary effect if you manage to organize yourselves into being one of the corruptors, essentially, if you organize yourselves into being a lobby. What that means is, in America, old people have a lobby, and they put unbelievable pressure on elected officials. Women have a lobby, the National Organization of Women, Emily's List, which I mentioned. All kinds of ordinary citizens raise money to put pressure on their elected representatives directly, not through, because we don't have this parliamentary system mediating between voters and their elected officials. So even though in India, women here are also the majority of voters, according to the Hindu Online, women voters far outnumber men in a number of constituencies. With a parliamentary system, you're going to be beating your heads bloody against a wall to try to get representation for women, if that's the way you do it. You need, I don't mean to keep saying you need, it's obnoxious, but every woman in every country with a parliamentary system needs a powerful citizen, national grassroots voter lobby organization made up of women and those who support women's issues to throw the election, basically. To say to the men running the country, you know what, if you don't give us X, Y, Z, and this is what I mean by playing hardball, we're simply going to give it to your opposition. That is the only way women have ever gotten the kind of representation and policies that they need, anywhere in any country for the last 70 years that I've been looking at this, by playing hardball, not by explaining why we're good girls and we deserve it. The rupee, the dollar. We have heard all day yesterday about this incredible growth in India, this 8% growth. So we all know the, truly tortuous and horrifying statistics about rural women in India and throughout the developing world. And the world is, in a way, poorly equipped to understand Indian women's situation and potential because those statistics tend to dominate discourse about Indian women. But what is elided is that huge masses of urban women consumers increasingly have their own money to spend and have their own clout as a result of having their own money to spend. One ad campaign surveyed 10,000 such women across 38 urban centers, and they broke them down into like Ms., I hope that I get this right, Hasmukh, popular, 27%, Mrs. Mary Awaz Suno, attention seeker, 31%. They broke them down into all these categories of consumer. So obviously advertisers internationally are lining up to, lower Indian women's self-esteem, to beam images of perfection at them, to persuade them, as they've persuaded women in my country, that they're simply inadequate as they are and need to spend money on this or that. The flip side of that is the consumer power that Indian women have to advance their goals. Because you can use your money to influence the media. There's a huge increasing vibrancy of media in India. India Today's Stable is a great example, and something unnerving for an American is to see all these versions of American magazines in India and much smarter versions of themselves. Like Time Magazine, India Today, smarter, right? Good housekeeping, keeping India smarter. But when women use their consumer dollar to pressure advertisers, not only to promote positive images of women, but to promote content that raises women's issues, then advertisers respond. If you write to India Today, sorry, Mr. Puri, I have to say this, or The Times, and say you're going to boycott their advertisers unless you give more space to women's issues, those editors, those publishers have to pay attention. They will respond. They'll turn on a dime. I mean, this is playing hardball. It's not friendly and it's not pretty, but it's effective. And frankly, the coverage of women's issues in India is as abysmal as it is in my country. You know, less than 10 to 15% of the content in your broadsheets, your quality broadsheets, are about women's issues, same as in my country. And there's no way you can move forward to this globalization that you all these, pardon me, powerful men have been talking about all day yesterday, God bless them, you know, without in-depth, profoundly insightful, serious coverage of issues that are holding women back. Women also have to learn to use the media to leak abuses, to get stories about inequities and corruption in relation to women to reporters. The average Indian woman, like the average American woman, needs to learn the phrase off the record and on background. Because women are scared to tell their own truths because they'll get punished, but they can leak their truth on background to a reporter. Finally, I encourage women to write the op-eds themselves, name names, start their own zines and blogs, and don't sit passively while this wave of globalization is about to sweep over you, dictating all kinds of stereotypes about what women should be and what their goals should be. Now I want to take you to a higher level, and it goes directly to respond to the kind of profoundly upsetting ethnic partisanship that we just experienced here a few minutes ago, and the kind of divisiveness that my country, unfortunately, is spearheading in the entire world right now. And I apologize. I wish I could make a difference. Thank you. A lot of good people yesterday were talking about globalization. And something that was very frustrating for me as someone on the left is that I heard very smart entrepreneurs talk about how fabulous globalization was, and then I heard equally smart left-wing politicians critique globalization but really not offer a constructive alternative vision of an intervention, a productive, a win-win, a visionary, humane, ethical intervention in globalization. And that is the only way forward. That is the only way when activists and people of conscience, critiques of unfettered globalization, critics with critiques of unfettered globalization, don't just protest and throw things, but sit down and work out a politics of engagement that raises social justice issues within the context of globalization effectively. Two examples, this is so not pie in the sky. Two examples, disinvestment in South Africa toppled a corrupt regime. Toppled it, it's gone, right? College kids in the United States knew about sweatshops and decided to put economic pressure on maquiadoras, on companies that were using sweated labor. And that pressure has slowly been changing some of the conditions of production in some of the developing countries that depend on textile exports. So these are just tiny incidental examples, but what I'm going to end with, do I have 5 minutes? Couple minutes. Quickly, is my profound assertion that women are not, it's not enough for women to just get equal power if we don't change the nature of power, and that it's in the interest of all of us here and all of us globally to change the nature of power. And so it's not a left-right divide, it's an ethical leadership versus an unethical leadership, ethical globalization versus unethical globalization divide. At the institute I founded, we teach ethical leadership, and it's like stumbling upon the cure for cancer. And I wish that the guys here and everyone screaming was present in the room. I hope some of them still are. Because guess what? It turns out that if you look at all the major religions, all of them, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, share the same 7 ethical precepts. Exactly the same. It's like the DNA of goodness. So what do they teach? One, honesty, right? The Bhagavad Gita says, truthful is the man born to inherit a godly destiny. Buddhism talks about right speech. Judaism talks about avoiding lashon hara, the evil tongue. An example of this in media leadership, Bill O'Reilly, a right-wing demagogue, said that he was wrong in public to support the Iraq War when he found there were no weapons of mass destruction. That's ethical leadership, even though I hate his politics. Kindness. Again, the Gita, let a man be friendly, compassionate. In Islam, it's Rahman, Rachamim. In Judaism, Rachamim. In Christianity, Agape. Buddhism, loving kindness. An example, the king of Jordan, Queen Rania's father-in-law, after a terrorist blast in Jerusalem, went to sit at the bed of a wounded Jew because he was a human being. And I don't think it's a coincidence that terrorism declined and softened when he was influential in the region. Peacemaking, Christianity, healing the breach. Gandhi's, of course, peaceful revolution that overthrew an empire. Martin Luther King speaking always an us, even to those who wanted him dead. The equality of all people. I'll zip through these. So important in globalization. I have a little bit more time. I can calm down, all right? I have a lot to say to all of you. In Hinduism, you're supposed to see Krishna in every conditioned being. In Christianity, every single person is made in the imago Dei. In Judaism, every single one of us is a spark of the divine. Everyone in Buddhism has Buddha nature. For globalization, for a corporate entity, for an NGO, what does it mean? It means that everyone, it doesn't mean Marxism, it doesn't mean equality of outcomes. It means that everyone, the person bringing us the tea, the person cleaning up the floor after we leave, is as precious, as worthy of dignity as the CEOs who are sitting here or in any major colloquium throughout the world. And that you create policy and you create structures that attend to this dignity and this respect accordingly. It doesn't mean no profit. It doesn't mean no competition, no commerce. It means a recognition of basic human worth. Justice. In all religions, there's a value for a system which is transparent, and again, in which criminals, like those who ran Enron, do time as well as the poor and the voiceless when they run afoul of the law. In which polluters and those who abuse their workforce, as well as petty thieves, face real punishment. Generosity. In the Gita, it says open-handedness is what people should practice. Christians tithe. In Islam and Judaism, hospitality to widows and orphans. Feeding the hungry and holy people in Buddhism and Islam. Starbucks, huge global, taking over the United States, taking over the world. Why? Their coffee is good, but it's not that good. They pay medical benefits to their workers. People want to work there. Their families can see a doctor when they're sick. Okay? A manifestation of this is a corporation that invests in the community's education and health resources because it's the right thing to do, and also because it's win-win over the long term. The last one is karma. I don't need to explain this here. I need to explain it in the United States often. The idea that you reap what you sow. What you send out comes back. Christianity talks about casting your bread on waters. Judaism, the same. Buddhism, Hinduism, of course, are karma-based religions. Over and over at Woodhull, we invite global leaders who have made huge change in the corporate world, in arts and media, in the law, to talk about why it matters to be ethical, and they're always asked by our young people, well, what if your competitor isn't, and you lose? And they always say, and we don't, prompt them. I was surprised. They always say that, yeah, in the short term you lose, but somehow in the long term it comes back to you. Somehow in the long term it comes back around. Whether it's that your reputation is for a person of integrity, or whether it's that somehow the universe closes this door but opens a better door down the road. Whether it's something as basic as they sleep at night, right? They are all absolutely certain that behaving ethically, even when in the short term it seems to be a challenge in a competitive global marketplace, is long-term absolutely worth it. So to conclude, I'd like to see those of us on the left advance win-win partnerships with those running global capital, most of whom, in my experience, are actually decent people who would like that kind of pressure and not just people throwing things outside the streets in Seattle, based on these ethical precepts, rather than just damning globalization or sticking to FDR-era solutions. Finally, in the case of women, and then I really will sit down, what I really want to see, in addition to the sort of leaps ahead in my country in years that I've described, what we really need right now is a developed world, developing world linkage of partnerships among women, which goes like this. You all know about Mukhtar Mai, a woman who was raped in Pakistan. Her case was amplified by the Western media, Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times. She won a Glamour Woman of the Magazine Woman of the Year award. This heightened visibility put pressure on George Bush to put pressure on the Pakistani authorities to basically not punish Mukhtar Mai for speaking up and taking action about her rape. I've seen many regional examples in the developing world get the kinds of reinforcements and resources that they need from the developed world when these partnerships come together. I was in Sierra Leone. 15,000 girls had been held sexual slaves. There was no money to help them. The white media paid no attention. Oprah did a segment. They raised $1 million in 15 minutes that went right back to these young women and the people on the ground who are experts. Obviously, the women in developing countries are experts on what they need and don't need expertise, need resources, need pressure on developed world governments to bring the pressure back around into the developing world governments to support them. So in conclusion, it's an unbelievably exciting time to be an Indian woman. It's an unbelievably exciting time to be an American woman. I'm so honored to have been able to feel the effervescence of what you all are spearheading here. It's extraordinary to be here at the beginning of this phase of your long revolution, your long journey toward women's empowerment with all the pioneers along the way. And I cannot wait to see all the ways in which you will shine a light for the rest of us. Thank you very much.
When India Today sent me the invitation to speak at this distinguished gathering, I was thrilled. Then I saw the title, Can Power Feminism Talk to Power Machismo? Which one am I supposed to be? I wrote back. I don't know where the editors of India Today got the idea that I'm supposed to be the emblem of power machismo. I'm Gujarati, for God's sake. My sisters haven't stopped laughing for weeks. It's true that I eat raw habanero chilies, but that's about the extent of my machismo. What would you do if there was a war between India and America? Who would you fight for? An Indian in England once asked me. He would hide under the bed, my then partner replied. Perhaps someone got the idea after reading my book, Maximum City, that I'm a tough guy because I hang out with the tough guys in Bombay, the tough cops, the gangsters, the political thugs. Well, the toughest people I met in Bombay weren't men. They were the dance bar girls, the bindas bomb babes who took the world and its sleazy and lovesick men on with confidence, with good humor, and survived. In Bombay, the bar girls used to dance fully clothed on a stage to Hindi film music, while men came to throw money at them and fall in love. There was no touching allowed in the bars. The men came to the bars not so much for lust as for love. In the big anonymous city, the bar girls' most favored body part was their ear. They earned the men's love by listening to their problems with their wives, their bosses, to the small and epic adventures of their metropolitan lives. The dance girls and the other women of the shadows can only earn a living in a world where men and women have stopped talking to each other. They're too scared. The men, especially. Exactly how do you make a pass these days at a lady you're fond of? Do you send her a note? You try to kiss her? Do you hire a plane to write words of love in the sky? Does your lawyer send a letter to her lawyer? Do you pull her hair? Or do you expect her to make the first move? She might well make the first move. In cities like New York and increasingly in Bombay and Delhi, there are huge imbalances of single women to single men. The chances of a single woman in her 30s finding a husband are, according to Newsweek, lower than her chances of being hit by lightning or being killed by a terrorist. The statistic has since been discredited, but when it came out, it threw women in a panic, and not just in America. I remember a woman in Bombay telling me about that study in explanation for why she had married a much older man, one who often shouted at her in public. At least I'm not out there scoping every night, she said. There's a kernel of truth to the study. Cities like New York or Bombay attract a disproportionate amount of young women who come to work in industries like media and advertising. Their parents aren't there to introduce them to eligible young men. They have to find one themselves. But post-feminist men are in an uneasy position. We can't look to our fathers for guides on how we interact with women today. We're not sole providers anymore. It's equally likely that a woman will put food on the table and expect her man to chop and cook it. We're expected to have an equal share in parenting, but the courts are stacked against men in most custody disputes. There's an epidemic in the developed countries of children growing up without fathers. Even in the conservative Catholic country of Chile, for example, 60% of the babies born last year were born out of wedlock. Somehow, the West has convinced itself that fathers are dispensable. This is where the otherwise objectionable Louis Farrakhan's Million Man March, in which he convinced 1 million black men to make a pledge to be responsible fathers, is a real milestone. The truth is that when men talk among themselves, it's different from when men talk to women. Just look at the lads' magazines, Maxim, FHM, and their ilk. They cover topics of vital masculine interest, such as how to get your girlfriend to agree to a threesome. And they're all now opening Indian editions. Consider the fact that the porn film industry earns more money every year than Hollywood. Modern men are not kind about women when they are talking with other men. So how do we bridge the divide? Much of the world views feminists with suspicion. They see people fighting for women's rights as an extension of Bush's crusade against Islam. When these feminists talk of women in developing countries, they often view them as victims. Well, the fact is that India has twice elected female prime ministers, while the US has yet to elect even a vice president who's a woman. In matters political, at least, India has done something right in the 60 years since independence. In a country which is 82% Hindu, we have a Sikh prime minister, a Muslim president, and an Italian Catholic widow as leader of the governing coalition, and nobody bats an eyelid. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam also now means Vasudhaiva government. Not only are the peoples of all nations one family, they are all invited to rule India. So Indians have a right to wonder, who the hell are these Westerners to preach to us about how we should treat our minorities or our women? But the Westerners are also partly right. Last year, 5,000 women were burnt alive because their families couldn't give the dowry their husbands' families demanded. In the last century, 50 million Indian girls were aborted or killed immediately after birth for the simple crime of being female. More than half of all Indian women are illiterate, compared to a third of Indian men. These are issues where men and women should not just be talking together, but fighting together. You don't have to use the F word. You don't have to be a feminist to see that a man beating a woman because her father hasn't come through with the dowry, or a woman earning half the wage for the same amount of work as a man, is just wrong. You don't have to be a feminist, you just have to be human. Humanism could replace feminism and whatever its converse is, machoism, masochism. Shortly after India Today invited me to represent Power Machismo, the feminist playwright Eve Ensler invited me to write a monologue for V-Day this June to fight violence against women. I accepted because I love women. I came out of one. And because there are truly violent things happening against women in the world today. Under the Taliban, women whose ankles showed under their burqas were whipped by the religious police. In Pakistan, there's an epidemic of honor killings. Every day, little girls are brought from the hills of Nepal to the brothels of Bombay to be raped for the rest of their working lives. Their numbers swelled considerably when, last year, the Maharashtra government passed a colossally stupid law outlawing the dance bars and throwing 50,000 bar girls out of work without any provision for their rehabilitation. The macho men in the Maharashtra government think of the bar girls as criminals, or worse, as victims. They sit smug in their government seats and decide what's moral and what's not. I have myself seen several of them throwing money in the same dance bars they are now banning. The girls are now out on the street or in dingy rooms on their backs working in another way. After each earner, there are 50 eaters, the bar girls told me. Each one of them supported entire networks of extended families in the villages they had left. The dance bar girls are, in my book, not victims. They are heroines. What's happening in India today is not the same thing as what happened in America in the 60s and 70s. Indian men and women don't have to follow the American example. We don't have to be that polarized. We don't have to be feminist or machistas. We have our own understanding of each other, which is complex and subtle and time-tested. Otherwise, there wouldn't be 1 billion of us. Unlike the advanced countries, Indians have no problems making babies. Our population pyramid is very broad at the bottom. We don't have to be the India of the Manusmriti, but we don't need to turn into the America of Sex and the City either. The modern urban Indian woman doesn't need anybody to fight on her behalf. She's perfectly capable of taking on the world on her own. The middle-class women that I know in Delhi and Bombay are powerful, resolute, and successful. They have the love of extended families and are far more comfortable with fathers and brothers than most of the women I've seen elsewhere. Indian women like their men. They even love some of them. And if a man expresses interest in them, they know how to handle it. They know how to say no, and they know how to say yes. If their boss makes a pass at them, they are perfectly capable of kicking him in the balls. If he then denies them a raise, they know how to sue him and win. The new Indian metropolis is a province of unimaginable change in an unimaginably rapid time. How on earth, for example, is a traditional Brahmin supposed to practice untouchability in a Bombay local train at rush hour? The metropolis erases caste and gender lines and upends traditions. I have been to beauty contests in the Bombay slums where grandmothers approvingly wash their granddaughters, prance around an improvised stage in swimsuits. I know of successful executive men in the same city who've given up the rat race to raise kids while their wives go out and work. There's a radical difference, of course, between urban Indian women and women in the villages, who are in much more solidly defined sex roles. But we can't just look at the Indian village as a province of superstition, discrimination, and illiteracy. This is the culture that has sustained the world's oldest continuing civilization. There must be something of real value to both women and men for it to have lasted so long. I am thinking now of the marriage of my grandparents and my parents, both arranged marriages. They're among the happiest marriages I have ever seen, although not quite equal in the Western sense. My grandfather ran his jewelry business on the first floor of an old Calcutta building, and my grandmother stayed home on the third floor and cooked and raised 6 children. As was the custom, not once in their lifetime did they say out loud each other's names. But they had no problems talking to each other, shouting, whispering, cajoling, threatening, pleading, singing. They never needed to step out of their roles. They never felt any need to stop becoming man and woman. My grandmother loved my grandfather not in spite, but because he was a man, and she liked taking care of him. She knew what he wanted to eat before he even realized he was hungry for it. And my grandfather always loved the pretty girl in my grandmother, the girl he got betrothed to when she was 13. Her beauty was no myth for him. He was exalted by it every day. When my grandmother passed away in her 80s, my grandfather had no more wish to remain on earth. "Your ba is waiting for me," he kept saying, and followed her in under a year of her passing. But could such a marriage work in today's India? I doubt it. We have to establish a new paradigm, a new way for men and women, not just to be with each other in a lifetime's union, but just to observe the everyday courtesies. No modern woman has time to serve her man 3 meals a day, as my grandmother did. She rightfully expects that he will serve her at least one of them. We will also never understand men and women until we understand the hypnotic power of lust and its role in furthering the human species. As Walt Whitman wrote, "It is not you alone who know what it is to be evil. I am he who knew what it was to be evil. I too knitted the old knot of contrariety, blabbed, blushed, resented, lied, stole, grudged, had guile, anger, lust, hot wishes I dared not speak. The wolf, the snake, the hog not wanting in me, the cheating look, the frivolous look, the adulterous wish not wanting." No subject is as fraught with necessary deception as this one. We lie about it all the time. We lie about it to each other and to ourselves. We seek out different people for different needs: sex, companionship, money, good breeding stock. The difference between men and women is starkly illustrated by the difference between male and female homosexuals. Most gay men are casually and guiltlessly promiscuous. It is a basic serving of sexual need. Lesbians, on the other hand, tend to pair bond, nest, seek lifetime nurturing relationships with one person. Yes, there is a difference between male and female attitudes to sex and monogamy, and it's about bloody time we were honest about it. It is the epic hidden story of the good and the great. It is the precedent of the most powerful country in the world groping a 21-year-old intern. It is princes, presidents, dictators unable to come out with their homosexuality or marry the people they really want to be with. It is our search for love, far more confused and ineffective than our search for wealth or security. And here, the real experts aren't doctors or sociologists or psychologists or self-help gurus or talk show hosts. They are poets and novelists. This is their core competency. They understand love like nobody else. As Faiz Ahmed Faiz said, the true subject of poetry is the loss of the beloved. The German poet Rainer Maria Rilke has provided what is, to me, the best guide on how men and women can talk to each other in his immortal book, Letters to a Young Poet. He advises young women and men not to throw themselves at each other, not to lose themselves in a love, quote, out of which nothing more can come, nothing but a bit of disgust, disappointment, and poverty, and the escape into one of the many conventions that have been put up in great numbers like public shelters on this most dangerous road. Rilke says, and this in the early 20th century, that we are only just now beginning to consider the relation of one individual to a second individual, objectively and without prejudice, and our attempts to live such relationships have no model before them. Someday, there will be girls and women whose name will no longer mean the mere opposite of the male, but something in itself, something that makes one think not of any complement and limit, but only life and reality, the female human being. This advance, at first very much against the will of the outdistanced men, will transform the love experience, which is now filled with error, will change it from the ground up and reshape it into a relationship that is meant to be between one human being and another, no longer one that flows from man to woman. And this more human love will resemble what we are now preparing painfully and with great struggle, the love that consists in this: the two solitudes protect and border and greet each other. Rilke's ideal hasn't materialized yet, but there are trustworthy signs glimmering and shimmering on the horizon of love. All over the world, there is a giant overthrowing of taboos. There is a giant choosing. Never in the history of the world have so many people chosen their own lovers: older lovers, younger lovers, other sex, same sex, richer, poor, taller, shorter, lovers for a day or lovers for a lifetime, lovers of all different races, castes, creeds. There is a gigantic experiment underway in the human race, a gigantic cross-pollination. So, since all other kinds of opposites are attracting and mating, here's my solution to bridging the divide between the toughest of men and women. Power of feminists should hook up with power machistas. The resulting explosion of primal passion will create power babies who will bring new vigor to our tired human species. More power to them. Thank you.
I've just been sort of very embarrassingly asked to address what you said. I kind of have to, because this is kind of...
I read that on your face.
Yeah, no, it's just like, it's the blessing and the challenge at one time, and it's kind of a microcosm of what's right and what's wrong about dialogue between men and women. So what you did is beautifully written, and it's so seductive, and I have a crush on you already. And that said, so I'm lulled into kind of, oh, let's just go to bed, and, you know, it's all okay. And yet the... Yeah, right, right. There's a lot going on at the India Today Conclave. But, but the feminist, and I say that proudly, in me was also, that part of my brain lit up at phrases like 13-year-old bride. I'm glad it worked out nicely for her, but I'm sure that we wouldn't want our 13-year-olds necessarily to be pledged in marriage. They lit up at essentialisms like, you know, lesbians do this, and so, you know, women's sexual nature is to bond and sort of nurture and nest. I wrote a book called Promiscuities, which talks about the other side of women's sexual nature, which is to explore and be curious and autonomous and kinky and, you know, provocative. And, well, I'm kind of blushing already, so I won't go further. You can buy the book, but it's much more complicated than that. And that kind of essentialism, though it's beautiful because you're such a beautiful writer and a nice person, is also very dangerous when it becomes codified in laws. For instance, in India, there are not gender-blind laws about who takes care of children. And it's my understanding that you have wonderful laws about flex time and family leave, laws that we would love to have in the United States, but that they're not gender-blind, they're for women. So that's a huge, to me, problem, designating half the population as your role is to nurture children. And it's a continuum. Your beautiful, beautiful kind of meditation on love is a continuum to this very inadequate and kind of harmful codifying of women's role in the law.
Well, thanks, Naomi. Come back to my room, I show my poems. The 13-year-old bride, I mean, I'm not advocating that we should lower the age of consent to 13. It's circumstances that I think most people in this room would have grandparents or great-grandparents who got married at a very early age. And yes, in the case of my grandparents, it worked in some strange way. Gandhi's written a lot about marrying a 13-year-old, and his was, when it was happy, a famously happy marriage.
Look, I have no doubt. I just have an 11-year-old, and I don't,
right.
you know, I don't want her to get married anytime soon.
Times have changed,
Yeah.
in other words.
Yeah.
And about the observation about lesbians and male homosexuals, I mean, obviously we're all speaking in generalities here, but I think any kind of either empirical study or anecdotal evidence would demonstrate that there are differences between male and female homosexuals, and it doesn't mean that some women aren't lustier than some men. Everybody is human, but I think in general there are, well, certainly biological differences between the sexes, and then there are other ways of thinking, just as we could speak in generalities about Indians and Americans.
Right.
And unless we do this, unless we make certain sweeping statements, well, first of all, we'd have a very boring debate, and and we'd have to basically limit ourselves to academic papers. So,
But
so go ahead.
to chime in, Kay, let me ask the other women. So there was this beautiful kind of idyll about domestic life, and And in it, there was this sort of beautiful, sweet moment where you acknowledge that most women, and it's very true, by the way, that from what I have seen in my brief sojourn here of elite, urban, professional Indian women, elite, urban, professional American women are pretty much their counterparts. I mean, we're living the same life in a lot of ways, you know, with obvious, complicated differences that we can address, I'm sure. But in that blissful domestic idyll, there is buried a whole discourse, a whole set of tripwires for women, and from what I've heard from Indian women in my brief journey here, these tripwires are coming to the surface now, and it's, you know, your sort of sweet kind of gesture that she'll make him 2 meals and he'll make her 1. Am I the only woman in the room who sort of had a reaction to being conscious of how much love and eros are conditioned on domestic equality, or are conditioned on how resentful or how supported you feel as a woman in the home, doing your work in the home? Am I the only woman who, no, I'm not the only woman, thank you very much, right? In other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is I've heard from many Indian women now, mostly from elite backgrounds. And by the way, I have a pile of statistics here about, you know, rural women and what they deal with, but I think everyone in this room is familiar with these statistics. Okay, what is surfacing in the conversations that I'm hearing is that, okay, yes, on the one hand, there's this beautiful extended family system, which is so nurturing, and I'm the first to say that Western feminism and Western sexual revolution and Western consumerism has gone very destructively, has walked the path of autonomy for the last 30 years in ways that are kind of good for individuals, but terrible for families, and terrible for children, and terrible for spirituality, and a lot of the things that you have here that are precious and intact, and that I would love to see your shift into, you know, a more fully kind of globalized society protect, and you know, your shift into a more fully egalitarian society protect. But what is surfacing is women are, you know, I went to lunch with a woman today who is really having a hard time with the fact that she's getting married and going to go live with her husband's family. And this is something that, these are feelings that I gather, you know, women just dealt with, worked with. The whole was more than the sum of its parts. You weren't almost allowed, from a lot of conversations I've heard, to ask questions like, who am I? What do I need within, you know, oneself? Because that's almost guilt-inducing. But I gather a lot of elite, educated Indian women are asking those questions now. And so your blissful idyll of 2 meals for 1 might not be her blissful idyll of 2 meals for 1 if she's working and you're working. Those tensions are going to start coming to the surface. So I hope that you guys have a lot going for you, which is you do have a culture, and we don't, that values the sacred feminine. And that matters.
I think it should depend on who likes to cook more.
Say it again?
The 2 meals for 1, it should depend on who wants to cook more. I personally would rather do the 2 meals and get fed 1. And it also depends on the cooking prowess of whoever. But I don't think it's, you know, I wasn't advocating for a rigid quota of how many meals are served. And here's my point about equality, that it's not a mathematical issue where the chores are divided up exactly equally, or the meals are, or the work is. I mean, there's something much greater than that. And I think that, well, to paraphrase Tolstoy, every happy marriage is actually unlike each other, because each happy marriage finds its own equilibrium in ways which resist any kind of ideology or mathematical division of it.